So, Michael was just
Or accessible anytime, anywhere.
So it's chocolate.
I'm working with David Goldberg, your Cedar, to do like an end cryptocurrency seizure process. Which is at scales. I did not. Very briefly.
I didn't, but I mean, I was looking at some of the stuff like help understand
Probably smart. I know they've already been, yes, you can call it testimony from the head of the Liver Association. Yeah, in like 2 days, he testified to your house.
he wants to set up some kind of
No, that's right. Yeah. It's very slow mission.
I think it does.
I mean,
Yes.
most of my folks work.
Yeah, do you work directly with Cameron Mary?
So we tried.
Okay, because I think he's doing something similar. Like identity management. I'm watching
Some kind of like proxy. So he's looking at watching some proxies. So the first I thought.
You mean like Hyperledger, or like one of those flavors? Okay.
First I thought he meant blockchain tracking on.
So it's telling some microphone data sources.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's
I thought it had something to do with
There's like something about malware.
So I have a myth.
There's some just like.
Cameron.
Things that just like erase it.
But right now, very wide ways of people are functioning. Because that's part of what developers and to understand the problem, right? Because understanding the problem is
Right. Right, and that's for identity, or is that for what the like SEC is? Or I mean, there could be overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I plan on it. I'm very.
She's gonna just have one. She doesn't need to get up and just be like, come to me if anyone else has questions. Sure.
Yeah, well, I say mainly. I just submitted a proposal for doing. Since I come from like a cyber background. Also for using various smart contracts.
Sure. Well, with a little more, yeah. But anyway, yeah, the fruits, but that's not
Sort of value that the mock master just said.
touch. It is Dutch.
My cousin married a Dutch woman.
Ah, well,
She's like 10 feet tall.
yeah, we're healthy generally.
She's gorgeous. She's like.
Oh, I know.
Strawberry blonde hair.
Yeah.
English eyes.
So yeah, you would still be able,
Playing
because it's
baseball.
still like reaching out over here, over your notes, so that's.
I know,
you still be able to
20 years later, this is.
that like never. But as far as like actually posting out the infrastructure, like you wouldn't be able to remove the smart contract, for instance.
Yeah.
And smart contracts have built-in access control mechanisms so that only certain people can sign your message. And make sure. So for instance, the second command and execute message, you don't really sign the person who maybe deployed the
Yes.
So the bots would be able to click on that and they'll still like full visibility or be able to see what's going on.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah. But anyway, my joke that when I explained what my grandfather's room had less back in 60s. They didn't meet the metric. But yeah, I confused you.
Yeah, you would still need to reach out to some sort of node. So you have a gateway
So the
on
Native Americans were slaughtered and
True.
yeah.
After that,
After that, yeah.
between that and the English.
It wasn't us.
It was a New Amsterdam. But anyway, yeah. But isn't it a lovely space?
This is great space.
Yeah, isn't it nice? Boy, these cars are awesome.
That's a fine.
This.
It's usually a mixed audience.
I like that too. I do have some It is, it's very cool.
My director never.
Oh, wow. Miranda in intelligence consulting, I like that.
I'm gonna grab the
San Diego. There'll be like a sailing boat there, you'll be running with the dog on the beach. Yeah. What I'll do. Oh, wait, why don't you write Washington? Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what I like about it. Very forthright. You know where you stand, even if it's.
No,
Yeah.
but I think to me.
Yeah, no, I can always go.
We're social people.
And,
That's how I got into it, yes.
you know, yeah, it's, they're like that. Well, I think the newer yeah.
Am I messing with your magic?
No, actually, they can load off my mind. I was waiting for Ian to come, so, yeah.
Me too. I don't know where he is.
Okay.
I know this is a.
Go ahead and enable.
I mean, I can just. I usually just open it in Chrome. One of the versions of this PowerPoint has just the link. I usually just do that, but this appears to be working.
Well, do you want it to play when you go to the slide automatically?
No, I just need to be able to have it play. It's my low standard for PowerPoint, but a video.
Okay. Let me crank the volume a little bit.
Okay. You guys can grab food. It's right outside.
I'm going to jail. No, I almost slugged her. Well, you know.
Yeah, I'm still doing this IRS. Well, actually, right now, the IRS project closed out, so we'll see what they close out. The one we were doing. But no, what else I want to do this. Anyway, bring my granddaughter coming next week, so maybe I can bring Spanish. She's good at Spanish. She's fine. She's really suddenly perked up on playing piano. With her mother. I know other people were saying that. Where? But, oh, yeah, she's now getting, have another nanny. Spanish and she's good English. So she was reading a book that only is English and quite well. That's good. Yeah, I can learn languages, no problem. She speaks English very well, of course. And that's what I know. But she doesn't like to be prompted, so I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. But if you say something in Spanish, you remember.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's pretty cool. It was definitely worth seeing if we were.
Yes. Also, I'm gonna play with it. Not API. I'm now able to read every single column. So now, and then I've also been able to where I can decide the C value. But not where I can take that key value, run it. That website. They build value back. Building value of that key. Yeah. So
Actually, I made sure to
specific. So yeah, there's a report request. Or the package. So yeah, it has to be. Not really. I read one. That's fine. That's what you see that.
So bad.
No, if you want to come check it out.
She told someone that like I like this band or person, and she was like, "This is awesome." I didn't even know there was a problem.
Really? Wait, so what? They changed it from what to what? I just gotta. Start date.
It was. Yeah, I don't know what truth is now. You know, the gold used to have like a light waxing. Maybe that's what
But, yeah, the issue with us was that it's still like. Well, I mean, for the like. Yeah, I'm just trying to learn. Yeah, I don't write very good. Yeah, I want to. Working on the coast. That's the only reason I read it.
I mean, it's like you got a lot of other. There's at least like 3 or 4 things that are like crash the app. And it wasn't just like it's like core function. I think the really funny one is whenever there's certain deals that like pop up. It's something that comes up like kind of the rest of the background kind of it's like front and center. Yeah, so it's like here's the new field. The way that he has it set up, you can't click out of it, and the cancel button doesn't work. So you have to. I've seen that on website. But you had to cancel it. That trick's going. I'm proud of my clean title. It needs to well. Clean title. Specify the branch and commit. I say this is the issue. I get steps 3 years, and I get expected behavior. Yeah, I'm supposed to actual like good processes that like fairly.
on switch and you're good to go.
Is it? Okay.
Oh, I also can't spell your last name, like for shit.
You're welcome.
I spell it wrong every time.
It's just remember, just like the president of the United
Yes,
States.
yes, not gonna do it.
One of the most famous.
Nope. Hey everyone, if you want to go ahead and take your seats, we're going to get started soon. No one out there moved. We're going to kick it off with the Mitre YouTube video, and then I'll go into a bit of an overview.
We're Mitre, and we're solving for a safer world by tackling the kinds of problems that no one else can solve. The really big problems, the internet-sized problems, the landing 87,000 planes a day safely type problems, the kind of problems that take data scientists, system engineers, economists, geologists, healthcare experts, and joint mission simulation labs to solve. Safer by solving important problems, like figuring out how to crunch a petabyte of data to identify a rogue pharmacy that's filling fraudulent prescriptions, and then connecting the dots to see how that might be a key to solving the opioid crisis. Safer by solving complex problems, inventing things like new GPS signals, which becomes foundational technology for pretty much everything, and then reinventing navigation to be less dependent on satellites and more resilient on the battlefield, more accurate on the runway, and safer just about everywhere you go. Safer by solving all kinds of problems, whether it's making sensors more affordable to deploy, your credit cards and electronics harder to hack, or underground drug trafficking tunnels easier to find. That's because Mitre is about sharing, not silos. We bring together industry experts and government agencies and academia to achieve a unique vantage point, to find answers, inform new policies, set new standards, and scale it up big so it makes even more people's lives safer every day. You can't count on a startup or a Fortune 500 company to do that. You need a company like Mitre, because we're not just any company and we're not in it for profit. We're a strategic partner that applies science, technology, and systems engineering to take on society's most pressing challenge, to make the world a safer place. We iterate, we invent, we model, we discover, we create, we lead, and then we share the answers. That algorithm, those prototypes, that 3D print your own drone in the field kind of solution, so that government, private industry, and the world can put it to use for the common good. We're Mitre. We solve problems for a safer world. Your world.
So if you've been to Tech Talks before, you've probably seen that video, but I think it's a pretty good overview of all the different things that Mitre does, since we don't just focus on cybersecurity, but since you're here at this month's Mitre Tech Talk, you are interested in cybersecurity. Before I hand it over to the presenter, I'm just going to do a quick background on what Mitre is in case you're not familiar. So we've been around for a little while. I think the big focus here is that we work to serve the public interest. So we're a not-for-profit company that kind of works on more like research and development type work. Today we operate 7 FFRDCs. The one that we are focused on tonight would be the National Cybersecurity FFRDC. We also do work with the FAA and aviation and CMS, Homeland Security, and the National Security Engineering Center. So we own and operate FFRDCs. We are not one. So to kind of understand what that is, they kind of are government-based research programs that kind of work in the public interest. So we don't really sell a product. We're not invested in the stock market. So we can really kind of provide an unbiased opinion to our sponsors. So a little bit more about the workforce. We have tons of employees. It's not even mine. We have close to 8,000 employees. We have a very high priority and focus on folks who have higher education. We have people here who have worked here for 3 years, like myself. We have people who have worked here for 25 years. So the capability area that we're focusing on tonight is self-sovereign identity. But as you've seen throughout other tech talks, Mitre has tons of different capability areas. I think one of our tech centers has close to 8, and the other one has the upwards of 15. So we do kind of focus on critical problem solving, social sciences, systems engineering. Last week, we heard from Sam, who spoke on cyber threat intelligence. We've heard from the Mitre attack team. We've heard from our adversary emulation team. So all these folks are coming here to talk to you about different areas of work that Mitre does. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Chris Buchanan, who is going to talk about self-sovereign identity. Your phone's on ring.
That was a longer walk than I thought it would be. Hey, thank you, Susie. So that beeping was me. I went to put my phone on Do Not Disturb, and I hit locate instead. And it's here, so found it. All right, so today we're going to talk about self-sovereign identity, and has anybody dealt with it before? Just anybody? Okay, awesome. So we're not going to go necessarily into how it works, at least in the briefing portion. I want to talk about why it exists at all and what it's for, okay? And then we can talk about how it works after that. Okay, so in 2011, the president, or the White House, I guess, put out the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. So this was their vision statement, okay? Individuals and organizations utilize secure, efficient, blah, 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 right? How'd that go? It's 8 years later. Everybody happy now? Good. So it basically had zero effect on the identity ecosystem, right? And they're talking about here user-centric identity, which is really their focus. Now, user-centric identity is decades old as far as concept goes. And really, one of the interesting things is in 2005, a bunch of identity experts got together and along with Kim Cameron, who led the group. Kim Cameron is Microsoft's architect of identity. And they came up with the laws of identity. And in this paper, you can Google it. I'd encourage you to read it, even though it's old. It's still relevant. And these 7 laws kind of dictate what identity should look like online. And then in the paper, they talk a little bit about why it can't look that way in 2007. And so user-centric identity, sort of a good idea that didn't have a technical solution. All right. So before we go on and talk about self-sovereign identity, we need to talk about identity. Right? Identity is an overloaded term, and social science doesn't help in this respect. But from a technical perspective, it's not very much different than how it operates. It operates the same online and in the physical world, right? So one of the things identity isn't is your true self, right? You don't even know your true self. Nobody knows your true self, right? Maybe Google, maybe. But it's sad and funny. We have this big self-help section because we have no idea. It's definitely not the true self, right? It's also not your body, right? Your body does not define your identity. Thank goodness for me, right? So it's definitely not the body. Also, identity changes over time, right? Who you are at one point is not the same as who you'll be later, is not the same as who you'll be later than that, right? So it's always moving. It's always becoming larger as a corpus of information. So the definition of identity that I prefer actually comes out of the laws of identity that Cameron put together in 2005, which is a set of claims made by a digital subject about itself or another digital subject. So that's the digital identity definition. And you can see how this works. My name is Chris. I work for Mitre. I am Mitre's capability area lead for digital identity, right? Those are all claims. And now I have said that about myself. You have heard me say it. You have a better idea of who I am. You might even have more trust in what I'm saying, right? Because those identity claims, which aren't necessarily true, by the way, all those are true. I attest myself that they are true. You're welcome. But all those claims are really what make up identity. And if you think about it as a set of claims, it makes more sense because it's contextual, right? Hopefully, I guess it depends on your kids, but if you have kids, you're not necessarily the same with your kids as you are with your coworkers, right? Your kids don't see you the same way. Your boss doesn't necessarily see you the same way as your subordinates, right? And this is just built into us to switch context wherever we go. And it's not duplicitous, it's just a different set of claims that is functional in that context. Does that make sense? Okay. So, okay. I put this out earlier, and if you're not a YouTube person, this probably doesn't make sense at all. So I ran it by some of my colleagues, and they were just like, what? But this is Matt Keck. Matt has a very popular video online in which he says that he's a snake, a big old slithery snake, and he's slithering through in your garden, right? And it's not funny when I say it. But if you go online and look, there's nothing wrong with it. Go and look. It is strangely funny. So this is just showing that that identity is a directed graph, right, with a subject and claims about that subject that can be represented in this way, which might look strangely similar to any database that you've used recently. Next. Okay. So remember when I said that claims aren't necessarily true, right? Who knows who this is? Mark Twain. What's his other name? Samuel Clemens, right? So his true birth name is Samuel Clemens. But does that change anything? Is his body of work less valuable because of a pseudonym? Do we know him differently because of a pseudonym? So when we talk about, and I'll talk about this briefly, when we talk about privacy, a pseudonym changes nothing. A pseudonym, meaning I take your name and erase it, take the rest of your data, where you've been, what you were doing, how you were doing it, and what you're going to do in the future, and put a different label on it to correlate that information as an individual, it is still your identity. Okay? By the definition of identity itself, it is still your identity. Okay. That's about as political as I'm going to get, I think. Okay, we'll see. We'll see. All right, so credentials. Credentials are a subset of identity. Credentials have specific properties. First of all, if my name is Chris is not a credential, right? If the state of Virginia says my name is Chris and puts it in a specific standardized format and people rely on that and it can be revoked, then it's a credential, right? So these three properties over here are the properties of a credential. Now, this is important because most of what we rely on online, as far as exchange of trust, comes in the way of credentials, right? There's a lot of things that we do socially where we show up here, we introduce ourselves, we talk about our jobs, but we don't then go prove it, right? I want someone else to verify that you are you and that the things you are saying are actually true. We don't do that in social situations. And if you do, you don't have a lot of friends, right? So you have, in a credentialed world though, you have an issuer who is basically vouching for you. And this is very important as we move on. So let's talk about self-sovereign identity, because that's why we're all here. And self-sovereign identity is just as much about the philosophy of identity and the things that I've just shared with you as it is about functional online identity. And ultimately, the core component of self-sovereign identity, the key tenet of self-sovereign identity, is that you have ownership, or ownership's a really bad word right now. So you have control over your identity, okay? And that means that you're the only one who can use it. You're the only one that can lose it. And we'll talk about functionally how that is affected later. All right, I said that was as political as I'm going to get. But when we talk about what is going on in identity today, I'd be remiss not to mention surveillance capitalism. Okay, Shoshana Zuboff, I hope is the correct pronunciation, is part of Harvard Business School. She's been doing this stuff for a couple of decades and has coined the term surveillance capitalism, has written a lot about it, has a new book that just came out. I'm working my way through it. But her earlier papers were all great, and I would commend them to you because for a full, deep understanding of the ecosystem for surveillance capitalism, that's the place to go. It's not necessarily about identity, and it's not going to help you do self-sovereign identity necessarily, but it will give you a foundation as to sort of the long-term reasons why. I don't want to recap her stuff other than to say this, to echo what she says here, which is that your online experiences now belong to someone else, right? Unilaterally, like you didn't necessarily agree to that, no matter what the 800-page document says, and that's problematic. Okay. So we need a choice, right? We need another option. And the reason that we don't have options today is because identity comes from platforms, okay? Online identity, think about it, comes from platforms. When you go online, you have nothing other than what a platform has given you. The cookies in your browser, from a platform. The essential root trust documents in your browser, from a platform, right? Your ISP stuff, all from a platform. Your email address, from a platform, right? And if you're running your own email server, you're just the platform, okay? Most people can't do that, so I don't really go into that too much. But functionally, it's not like the physical world where you're here, you have an identity, right? You can say things about yourself, I can say things about you, it builds over time, and you have this corpus of information by which people interact and acknowledge and understand you. That's not what happens. You functionally go to a platform and check out your identity like it's a hall pass to be able to walk around the internet. Now, we've tried, I say we very liberally, because I did nothing, but as humans, we've tried to fix this problem in various ways. PGP is a good example, so pretty good privacy, right? The idea was to have your own certificates, right, that you could basically cryptographically verify yourself, and that would be basically equality with the platform. The problem was you still needed basically an IT degree to use PGP, and Lord help you if you got to rotate keys and do all those things. It was not user friendly, and therefore not adopted. And if functionally, if everyone on the internet can't access it, then it's not functional identity. Okay. So the way that self-sovereign identity addresses this problem is to take those key root trust stores, like, you can think of it sort of like decentralized PKI or more appropriately distributed PKI. When you talk about, a centralized system, that's today's platform. And I don't care if it's federated, it's still centralized. If an entity can decide to remove your identity from the internet, it is centralized, okay? So if you have Google and it's federated and you're using Google login on 25 sites and Google says, I don't like what you said online, I'm taking your identity away, you lose access to all 25 of those sites, you might as well never exist. That's a problem. So with self-sovereign identity, you spread the key infrastructure across multiple services, ideally through the use of blockchain. You also have multiple blockchains and multiple identities, right, all across, and you spread everything out. And what happens when you come to the internet already with an identity is you become peers with the platform. Now think about that. Since the internet started, like the day it started, we were peers. 10 minutes later, we were not, right? As soon as you needed the login and password to get in, it was over. There was no peers. The internet is ruled by platforms. So now, think about the things that become possible, right? We use email because it's convenient. But if we all have keys, we could talk directly to each other. We don't need that. We don't need a platform to intermediate on our behalf and facilitate that communication and then collect all the metadata, right? We don't need that. Not if we can come pre-identified. Okay. So let's talk about decentralization and distributed technologies, just real quick. Decentralization is a direction, not a destination, okay? It is very difficult to make an argument for a fully decentralized platform or capability, because in the end, we all know, especially if you've been watching blockchain, if somebody doesn't like it, it forks. Now you got another blockchain, right? But whoever's making the decisions about what goes in the code base, it's not decentralized, right? It's one. So the hope is, right, and the design, as you will see momentarily, of self-sovereign identity is not to be tied to any specific technology. It actually mirrors the internet itself, right? The internet itself is a meta system. It doesn't have, like, you can't go to the store and buy some internet, put it in your pocket and go home, right? You can buy a router, you can buy a computer, right? But the system itself is just made up of all these component parts with some rules in place to let everybody know sort of how to get by. Self-sovereign identity is exactly the same way. It's a meta system. It does have functional components, and you can develop and build those components. But at the end of the day, it's the rule set, right? It's what's normal in this ecosystem that make it work. But the good thing about that is, like the internet, it scales well beyond any identity system that exists today. Okay, so next. This is a decentralized identifier. It is an example decentralized identifier out of the Decentralized Identity Document Specification under the W3C version 1.0. Okay? This is what it looks like. Does that look familiar at all? Does anybody see anything that looks familiar? What? Exactly. It is a URL. This is just a different type of universal resource locator. The first thing says, I'm a DID, right? www, I'm internet traffic, so the DID just identifies that what follows is a decentralized identifier. The next section where it says example is the type, right? So it's sort of, what do I expect on the other end? And that will tell you which blockchain to go to. Currently, I want to say there are 8 different blockchains right now that you can write DIDs to and that are addressable through this format. And then the last part is the actual unique address for whatever it is you're going to locate. And that thing that you're going to locate is a decentralized identity document, which looks kind of like this. Not exactly, but very similar. So it starts with a context, and the context basically tells the machine that's reading it how to read it, right? So as a developer, you hit that context, it'll take you to another URL where hopefully, according to the spec, you don't have to do this, but you should. There's a document that tells the machine what to expect within the rest of the document. There's the ID, which is the DID we just talked about. It should match, right? And then there's the authentication, which includes another ID as well as the type of authentication that it's going to use, and then, of course, the public key, right? So now your public key has a URL that you can present, and they can go verify it, because if you look down here at service, it actually tells it where to go to get the rest of that information. Now, this is not a credential, right? Remember we talked about the difference between identity and credentials? It could be, but in order for it to be a credential, you have to follow the verifiable claims format from the verifiable claims specification, also under W3C, under the identity, what is it? Not the working group, but the identity group under W3C. Seriously, if you Google it, it'll come right up. Verifiable credentials. So this is sort of, I'm not going to put a verifiable credential up because it's a mess. Just give you an idea of sort of what's under the hood. There's the credential identifier, which is not your identifier, right? The credential itself, like your ID card, your driver's license has a driver's license number. So that's the equivalent of the driver's license number. And then there's one or more claims that are under that. And those claims are going to have your DID, right, that identifies you. And so when I come in to look at this, I can see that this claim is actually about you, not about someone else. And then you have the credential metadata. I won't go too much into that. But most importantly, you have the issuer signature. So remember, a credential is someone else verifying that you are who you say you are. And so this says, not only, I am Chris, I work for Mitre, I'm the capability area lead for digital identity, but it has Mitre's signature attesting to that fact at the bottom. And this is what's written to the blockchain. Now, I will say, PII doesn't go on the blockchain. So those plain text things, those typically are off-chain. But if you remember, when we go back here, right, you're going to go retrieve the credential sort of off-chain. Okay? All right. So I covered a lot of ground, a little bit messy maybe. Believe it or not, I put this together today. So I would love to talk about this with you at this point. So one thing I didn't say, which was very important to say, is that in self-sovereign identity, you generate your own private keys. Okay? The crypto people in here were like, well, how does this help? Right? That's how it helps. You generate your own private keys because that's the only way that nobody else has them. Right? If you think about private keys today that you have, all of them came from somewhere else, right? Unless they're unsigned, right? If they're self-signed. But if you have a verifiable key, somebody else generated that. Well, that's no longer the case. So in self-sovereign identity, you generate your own private keys. You then write those public keys as a did to the ledger, right? And then anyone can go and verify other things that you sign against that private key that only you hold, so then only you can validate. Does that make sense? Okay.
Once somebody has used your sovereign identity to their platform, rather than using their platform identifications, do they have to continue to invoke the public keys to use it? This is sort of in the context of the surveillance capitalism.
Yeah.
Is this a way that people will be able to track into their data? Or is this just a better verification for the platform?
Right. So it is a better verification for the platforms. However, this requires not just technology, right? You've hit upon something that's key. If you're going to give the platform identity information and then they just copy it to someplace else and use it for their own purposes, how is this better, right? First of all, it depends. But there are definitely regulatory things that have to happen for this to work well, right? But today, we can't make those regulatory things because there's not an alternative, process. Everything that we would do, like GDPR, is a patchwork of addressing the symptoms and not the root cause. Instead of just addressing how companies handle data and having a legal battle as if identity were property, right? Let's change the conversation altogether and have a system that allows me to definitely know that this is what I'm sharing or not sharing, at least in step one. Now, we can go further a little bit. Like I said, I didn't want to go too much into the technical stuff, but there's also a concept called identity hub. So when you have a self-sovereign identity like this, you can take that credential and you can break it apart. So let's say I take my first name and street and I put it in two different cryptographic containers and I stick it in Atlanta, and then I take my state and driver's license number or whatever and I stick it in, California. And all of this information is in these little tiny cryptographic containers that now, when that gets breached, because it will, right? When that identity hub gets breached, what do they have? They have a bunch of uncorrelated information because the only correlation is in the DID, which they can't see because it's not in the identity hub. It's the DID that points at this, not the other way around. So what I then have is a huge compute job to try to open up all these containers only to have uncorrelated data. So functionally, it takes data breaches and instead of making them bank robberies, turns them into pickpocketing. So now I have to target the end user's device. I have to get to the root data in order to do the correlation, and then it's a different problem, right? And for most of us, it's not a problem at all because it's too hard to target just anyone.
How is blockchain self-sustaining?
So the blockchain itself, the blockchain sustainment is its own problem. right? The DID spec is agnostic of the blockchain. So you kind of hedge your bets, and you could write these to multiple blockchains, so you don't have to just like pick one. And that's, but as far as a blockchain being self-sustaining, I'll just mention a couple, right? Bitcoin is one of the blockchains you can actually put these things on. That's been fairly self-sustaining. You also have recently the Sovereign Network, which Mitre actually just joined. So there's about, I want to say, yeah, I don't want to say a number. It's over 100 companies that are associated with the Sovereign Network and are running nodes at cost, at their own expense, because they functionally just believe in this, right? And those nodes are what sustains the blockchain. And in that model, it's a permissioned public blockchain versus a unpermissioned public blockchain, which was faster and, you know, whatever. But the answer is I don't know, you know, ultimately. So that's right. The nice thing about that is that the blockchain is the middleman. So you still have the original private keys because those are in your device. You still have the data because that's in an identity hub. And then you have to rebuild the attestations and the verifiable credentials. And as a community, I'm not sure we know how to do that yet because we're all very optimistic about the longevity of a blockchain. Sure.
If that's the case, however, with regard to the blockchain background, couldn't there emerge several blockchains and then they're just really a new type of platform?
Yeah, so this is really why it needs to be not just decentralized, but distributed, right? And so when I don't remember which way this was. Nope, that was right. So this one, right? So it's not enough to be decentralized. Just having your stuff on a bunch of different blockchains or just having it on one blockchain that's decentralized is not enough. You have to distribute it across multiple blockchains to basically hedge against a specific hegemony, basically.
So it might be on several blockchains.
Absolutely, yeah.
Theoretically.
Yes.
Unless, you know, fiat, some sovereign government that will issue everybody now this new type of identity and will maintain the blockchain.
Right, yeah, interesting you should mention that. Yes, so actually next year, I'm doing a project with the state of Maryland to do sort of the first self-sovereign identity system for a US government that I know about. I mean, Illinois did some work in blockchain, but as far as self-sovereign goes, I think this will be the first one unless somebody beats me to it, but we'll see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe I know something, but I don't see this platform really invents malicious data. It verifies what is on the chain, but it doesn't know if the credential is real.
That's correct.
Sort of confident that using.
Right, absolutely correct. You know, going back to, you know, the lie part of it, right? Pseudonymity or just false data is absolutely possible.
Sure. So my question is,
people online can't hear.
DIDS verifies whatever is on the chain, but it doesn't know if the credential is good or is fake, is malicious. So PKI uses certificates, CA, so it can verify the credential bearer. But how about this platform?
Yeah, so the attestation is only as good as the process for the attestation. And there is an identity, factually, never any like guarantee that what you're being told is true. This, and I say all identity is probabilistic, right? From the moment your mother first lost sight of you, your identity has been probabilistic, right? You are most likely her child. You look like them, you smell like them, okay? But there's a chance, right? Just like there's a chance that I'm not telling the truth, just like there's always a chance that someone is doing something malicious. And the way we handle that in the physical world is through risk management, right? We look at the likelihood that something's going to happen, and we look at the impact of that thing that's going to happen, and then we make a risk-based decision. Every time you hire a babysitter, every time you order food from a restaurant, you are making a risk-based decision, right? And that decision is primarily based on reputation, okay? So currently, reputation isn't functionally built into the specifications of self-sovereign identity, but when all attestations are signed, there is a very strong incentive to have true attestations. Does that make sense? And let me be clear. You can make money in this system by having true attestations. You cannot make money in this system by having false ones. So if I have a business to do validation, verification, and attestation of your identity, right? This is a whole new business model, by the way. You're welcome, right? You said, just like you go to the labs now for your medical stuff where it's not the hospital, it's not the doctor, it's just a lab. Same idea, right? You don't go to the bank and give them all your identity stuff. You go to one place, which is the identity place. You validate with all your documents, they attest, and then you use that everywhere you go, right? It could be the DMV, it could be whatever. But what you're talking about is just the cost of doing business and identity. You never know whether or not someone's malicious for sure. But this system gives you a much stronger incentive internally to have good attestation and a way to find out if the person or thing doing the attesting is often wrong, potentially. So those reputation systems they're debatable whether or not they're good, right? Because the other incentive in self-sovereign identity is to keep this identity forever. Let me show you something.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah.
I think the third-party identity store or your new business model, can it be a separate and independent blockchain? So I put my certificate whatnot on that chain. It doesn't. It's also a decentralized store. There's no one that's just in charge or running that store. It's all distributed as well.
You're talking about the private keys?
No. Not private keys. Like a hash of private keys or certificates that can verify that I am a good person. I'm a good user.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. And this is so I was torn between going into all the functions because I didn't know what the audience would be. But clearly, if you're going to be an issuer of credentials, you will have to have a server that answers queries on the attestations that you've made. Okay, so that process of that verification, you can go verify that signature and the credential with the issuer, right? Because there's a link in there that says, here's where you can go to do that. And so when you come to me and you say, I have a degree from Columbia University, I can just ask Columbia University if that's true, right? And they say, yes, I'm like, good to go. I believe you now. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? So it's not it's not decentralized, right? Each issuer is responsible for their own infrastructure to answer the queries on their issued credentials.
That sort of makes sense, but that, in my opinion, resembles PKI. And it still bears the risk of the CA is compromised. So the whole chain is no longer good.
Right. So it is PKI. There's a new spec coming out, DPKI, which is decentralized PKI. that's being worked on right now to kind of answer some of those questions. But most of the problems that make PKI insecure actually come from the whole third-party system, right? It is sometimes the selection of the user and what kind of certificate to generate, and it is sometimes an exploit against the certification authority, and it is sometimes a man in the middle because it's hard to know if that's happening. And so really, when you do bidirectional attestation, when I say I'm me and you say you're you, and we go both check with other third parties that that's true, man in the middle becomes a lot more complex because you got to be in the middle of 1, 2, 3 places at least, okay? So and I think as engineers, we have to ask ourselves the question, not is this perfect, but is this better, right? And this is better.
It's a hybrid model.
Yeah.
Just a comment on this conversation that we were just having. One of the other ways to address it, and I don't know whether people are thinking about this, you might be able to shed some light, or anybody in the room for that matter, is instead of relying on a hierarchy of certifying authorities, if you will, to sort of attest to your identity, if you will. One could also do something like a zero knowledge proof. That's the other thing that people are talking about in ZK kind of stuff. Any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So zero knowledge proofs are actually a big part of what's called minimization, right? So when you get into the philosophy of self-sovereign identity, minimization is one of the philosophical components. And in minimization, let's take me going and buying alcohol at the Virginia ABC store. If that's not familiar to you, then I'm sorry. So you go into the store, you select your item, you go to the front, and you hand them a state-issued ID, and they look at it. Then you hand them a credit card, or you swipe your credit card or phone or whatever, your payment mechanism, and then you pay, and then you leave, right? And so in the course of that transaction, in some cases, the store has your credit card number and potentially your address, height, weight, eye color, right? All the stuff that's on your driver's license. When in fact, they only needed to know true or false. Is it legal for me to buy in this location? And do I have enough money to buy it, right? Those are the two questions that need to be answered. And so what self-sovereign says in the minimization component is that we will generate on the fly, we can generate a proof using the other credentials as a mechanism to do that, that is zero knowledge or just says yes, right? It's illegal for me to buy here and I have enough money. So your minimization is really kind of how you try to get around the platform over collection problem in the interim with a long-term goal of sort of regulatory requirements for minimization. Okay. And so does anybody not know what zero knowledge proofs are? Okay, yeah, all right, now, a stupid question. It's an embarrassing thing to stick your hand up, so I should have asked, does everybody know? Yeah. So a zero knowledge proof is a form of homomorphic encryption, meaning one way, like a hash algorithm. And you have to know something in order to get the right, one of the several right numbers that prove that you have some knowledge, okay? And a popular example is if, let's say, between those two doors, there's a hallway with a locked door in the middle, and it's got a combination lock on it. And I tell you, I know the combination. And to prove it, I'm gonna go in that hallway where you can't see me. And then you just tell me, come out left or right. And if you say left, I come out the left side, and if you say right, I come out the right side. If we do that once, maybe you trust me, maybe you don't. But if we do it 100 times and I get it right, you can be pretty sure that I actually know the combination of that door, correct? So that's generally how zero knowledge proofs work. There's interactive proofs like that, where there's kind of back and forth, and then there's non-interactive, which I don't understand at all. I'm not a cryptographer. I tried reading the 7 pages on it and it broke me at page 4. But if you're interested, we can bring a cryptographer up here. No, okay. Yeah, so, but generally speaking, the zero knowledge ones are just a number that can be, if you know the question that's being asked, you can prove through the zero knowledge proof or through the non-interactive one that you know that with, you know, some risk, but very little. Okay, yeah.
Another good book to read is Kevin Mitnick's book, A Ghost in the Wires. Everybody's probably familiar with that. It's a book about this guy who basically engineered his way through, social engineered his way through a lot of hijinks on getting into telephone systems and then online systems. What's to keep a Kevin Mitnick from actually getting several identities rolling out there?
So I will start by saying, hopefully we all have several identities out there, right? For example, I don't want the same set of claims for my doctor that I want for Mitre or that I want for, you know, to fly with, you know, for TSA to fly somewhere. So when we talk about identity, remember it's a set of claims. And so functionally, every credential you have is a different identity. So I hope to have multiple credentials, which are multiple identities. And, but the meat of what you're asking is, how do we prevent someone from pretending to be someone else?
Or being, yes, not someone else literally, but just false identities.
Yeah.
Ghost in the wires. So
we don't prevent them from being false identities. And the reason is that pseudonymity doesn't change identity, okay? And when we talk about this list of facts, as it points back to Pat in this case, if Pat is a number or URL, it doesn't change any of those other facts. Now, it also, in this scenario, doesn't change the fact that other people have attested to it, right? Now, if you run across somebody that wants into your data center and they only have self-attested claims from the last 2 weeks, you should think better of it, right? And so in this case, what you're gonna wanna see is that the company that they say they work for has actually attested that they're an employee, right? That they have a state-issued credential that's validated by the state. So you see how hard Kevin's job becomes, right? To get in that door when all I have to do is look up some URLs and verify some signatures, and I can know for sure that the state, you have that state credential and your company's credential.
yeah, certainly when it gets into state credentials, it's
Yeah.
online. But you confused me a little with your opening statement. I thought one of the beneficial attributes of this would be you'd have a universal unilateral identity.
Yeah.
Now, portions of that identity, credentialing and claims portions, might be or not be needed for certain, you know, places where you're asserting that identity, like your doctor versus your pizza place.
Right.
So are you saying that that's not the case? That you actually would have multiple identities on the blockchain for different purposes?
Yeah, so let me start with identity again, right? And so if I have more than one identifier, like today in your pocket, or purse, you have multiple identities. Your credit card number is an identifier, has your name attributed to it as well as some accounts. It's got facts about you on the back end with the bank. Your state-issued identifier or credential has different identifiers on it, but a different number than on your credit card. So functionally, that makes multiple identities.
Or identifiers. I would distinguish between identifiers and
So
identities.
The problem is, in a self-sovereign world, the only place that the correlation of the identifiers happens is in your wallet.
Right.
So from external to your wallet, every identifier is a separate identity unless you correlate it intentionally.
Then I lose sight of what the benefit is of this approach.
Okay? What is it you're trying to solve?
Having a universal identity rather than signing up for every platform, which is where I thought we started.
Right, so you can still do that, right? So you have Maybe you have a platform identity, right? But so think about the interaction, right? If you use Apple Pay today, if you think of a credit card as an identity, you have 3 or 4 credit cards loaded in Apple Pay or Android Pay. You come up to the kiosk, you double click, you select the identity you want to use, and then you use that, right? That's much different from a user experience than having to remember all the logins and passwords and tokens and, you know, one-time passwords, all of that. So really, it kind of goes back to, is it better, right? And from a manageability perspective, it's far better. And I always have the option, if the platform accepts it, to use the same credential on multiple platforms, and the platform cannot revoke my credential. Okay?
Now, it seems to me like you mentioned in my wallet, I have several identifiers.
Yeah.
From just my sort of intuitive perspective, I only have one identity item in my wallet, and that's my license.
Yeah.
All the others actually were predicated to some extent
Mhm.
on that license ID. So in a way, you could say that the subsidiary cards, like the credit card, et cetera, were a different credentialing subset of the main core state-issued license.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like this system works like that. Each one of the credit cards would each be as sovereign identifiers / identities would be as sovereign as the state-issued license.
Okay. So I want to make sure we're separating credential from identity, which we've done. And then if this is an identity, right, you have that initial root path, right? And let's say that's me, right? Now, every time a claim gets made by me or on me, right? If my bank says I have an account here, if whatever, all of that grows and grows and grows and typically tends to approximate more or less my true identity. Now, when a platform wants to allow you to log in, the platform knows what to ask for. It's not going to ask for alumni of, right? It's going to ask for something else. And so when you go to log in, it's going to say this platform wants to know, well, it wants proof that blah, 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 blah. And it may just be, it wants to know that you have a private key. Ideally, most platforms for email and stuff like that, that's all they really need to know. But let's say it's a bank and they need to know more. They need to know your address and your bank account and all of that, right? So what will happen is on your wallet, it'll pop up and say, your bank wants blah, 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 blah. Do you agree? And for how long, right? So you do your agreement with the bank. Maybe it's forever. Maybe it's for just this one time, whatever it is. And then the bank does that. And then they turn around and issue you a claim. And they say, you are a member of this bank, or you have an account at this bank. And that gets added into that corpus of claims that now you can go somewhere else. And if they want your bank account number, or they need to do a transaction to find out if you have enough money, then they can ask that question. You can approve them to have that information for the one time or for whatever. And then they can verify it with your bank, right? So you see how it sort of builds and it's very flexible. And so now, instead of presenting your whole identity, there's a thing called a presentation where you take pieces and parts from anywhere across that whole distributed network of things and present them as a kind of custom credential for that site. Possibly. So what I'm talking about is the art of the possible, right? It's not like you can go get a wallet that does this today. This is a system that's being built. Does that help?
It does.
Okay.
It's an interesting concept. Kind of view from different perspectives.
Yeah.
As to what its benefit is.
Right.
So these credentialing nodes, though, would be key.
Yes, they would be part of the key, certainly.
Figuratively speaking,
Mhm.
in the sense that that's where this expanding wallet would reside, in essence.
Not the wallet, no.
Not the wallet?
No. The wallet is on your device.
Okay, so all that, if you added in bank information to your wallet, that would only be on your device. So
the credentials, so the DID, right? So when we talk about what would be on your device, those would be on your device as shareable with all kinds of metadata. And then when somebody wants to prove, for example, you have enough money, you provide them the DID to go out and get that information. And then they can go out themselves to the DID document, which will tell them.
So the bank would still retain your information, bank information.
Yeah.
But the DID would give permission for some third-party utility to then add that in as part of their credentialing of you for them.
That's right. So the DID would basically give them the instructions on how to access it, because before that, they didn't know how. Additionally, the wallet is responsible in the identity hub for authorizing access for the other party, because you're not just verifying me, I'm verifying you, right? So I am making sure that I'm giving the right person the information, and then I tell the identity hub that you can actually access it.
So the blockchain would act as a constant state machine, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it.
So you're every time you did that new kind of iteration of your DID, it's your DID that would be on the blockchain.
The DID is static. The DID is the URL to this document. This document is there forever and never changes. It can be revoked, right? But the revocation happens at the issuer, and that could either be your device or someone else's wallet. And so when I go and check and make sure that this is still a good credential or claim, I can find out that it's actually been revoked. Yeah, sure.
So essentially what the blockchain is doing is ensure that every DID is not, it preserves the namespace.
So the namespace, no, but what the blockchain functionally does, remember, we're replacing certificate authorities, right? And in replacing certificate authorities, we need a way to make sure that the data doesn't change and hasn't been manipulated. So what the blockchain does is add confidence in the data itself that it hasn't been tampered with since it was written.
That's true, but what I was saying was nobody else can also come in and impersonate the same DID as it offers somebody else.
That's right, but yeah. So that is part of so the wallet generates the DIDs.
And that gets into the blockchain.
That's right. Yeah. Well, the DID document gets written to the blockchain with the DID as part of the ID, or as the ID.
So when a new DID is being generated, I'll ask for to check if there is something.
I hope so. Yeah. But it is a huge address space as well. So,
The concept is very similar to what came out.
Yeah. Okay. There's more.
Wait.
They want to mic you up.
The way that I understood this platform is compared to PKI is that in PKI, basically you have one root CA, and from there the chain goes down till it reaches you.
That's right.
And then you claim your identity based on the trust level of the CA.
Yeah.
So here I feel that rather than this hierarchical architecture, it flatten out in a distributed way.
Yeah.
So you have multiple verifiable nodes, and each of them, they can attest to your claim.
That's right.
Now, the underlying assumption of this to work is that there are majority of these verifiable who are trusted, who playing right. Now, if there are malicious players, then basically they can attest and verify a fake identity.
Right.
And if you query against all of those, you feel that better reputation maliciously, and you trust that.
Yeah.
So my question is, how you quantify the trust for each of the claims? What is the trust metric here?
So I don't like the word trust. I think that the word trust is misdirecting, because it's really about risk, right? Because the conditions under which I would trust you change with context, right? If like I said, if I'm hiring a babysitter, it's a different kind of trust than if I'm ordering a pizza, right? So when you talk about trust, what you're really talking about is a probabilistic calculation of risk. And what this does for you is I need to stop putting this down. What this does for you is it gives you that directed graph that you can calculate, right? You can calculate some risk. And because I know the attestations are signed, I can look at not just the attestation, but the reputation of the attester, right? So that becomes a very important part of the ecosystem that's not yet developed, by the way, but you can see with enough, like, you know, we have the technology to traverse trees and do math, right? Like, we've been doing that for a while. So this is just a directed graph, which is our favorite kind of graph in computer science, right? There's nothing better. So now that we have all of the math to do this, the system will functionally start to allow you to assess risk better, because it's not just about one certificate, right? A root CA, which, by the way, isn't hard to get. Thanks for trusting me, I guess, right? I had $400. That's what it attests to. So so this actually has some level, because it has some level of reputation that's not just the root CA, it is about my connections, right? As you need to validate and trust me more deeply, you can ask for more and more proof, right? You want to see that I was born in, 1985, not really. So you want to see that I was born in a long time ago? Then I can prove that to you. I don't have to show you my birth certificate, but that is then signed by the state I was born in, and now you feel better about that, right? Because the state isn't typically going to falsify stuff, right? And if the state is falsifying stuff, you might be in more trouble than you want to be at that point. But,
Does this system actually benefit people with more
thanks. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
newer people who pay can get the partial third-party verification.
Right.
Would be disadvantaged inside a system because they wouldn't have a network.
So it's hard to say disadvantaged initially, because also this is a two-sided market, just like the internet. Users come with platforms, platforms come with users. In this market, relying parties require users, and users require relying parties. And so the ecosystem itself is sort of self-balancing in that way. Does that make sense? So.
But also, for example, like establishing credit history, you can deposit.
Right.
The equivalent of this would be to buy your way to getting someone with a high reputation to validate you, which would defeat the whole purpose.
They're going to ask you to say that into the mic, please.
So to help newer participants in the system, is there a way that you could credential yourself to a high reputation person by, not person, but whatever, validating authority by buying your way in?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you could buy your way into most things, right?
Right.
I mean, so when you
Which
talk,
sort of defeats the decentralized purpose of
so it sounds kind of like you're talking about like people buying Google reviews,
Mm-hmm.
right? That kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, however, the difference is that those are signed cryptographically and traceable. So now it becomes kind of apparent pretty quickly when everybody has, sort of these same things. But also why? Like, what is that? So if I say you're a good guy, right, to a friend of mine, that might mean something to my friend. But if I say you're a good guy to a stranger, like, what do they care, right? I mean, it doesn't affect the trust relationship. So the value proposition here from a claim perspective is really about the relationship, which puts this squarely back in the way that physical identity works, right? That's sort of the genius of the whole system. Identity is rectified back to the way it works in the physical world. Somebody could always be taking advantage of you or lying to you, but how do we deal with that? We trust a little at a time, right? And certainly if you have a wide network, when you say give advantage, right? I would say early adopters have a fiscal advantage in this space. Because if you have market share on doing claims, right? If you're the identity store that I go to and you're the first one, you're probably going to have a pretty good, solid user base out of the gate as this grows.
And I unintentionally went down the path of the wrong way, which was defeating the system. My main intent was, yes, early adopters have an advantage and once it builds up, but later entrants who don't have enough nodes are at a disadvantage.
Well, I don't know, because I think it's not really different in most cases. If I'm showing up for my first day to work at Mitre, they're going to want the same common things. And if those things are available to one person, they're probably available to someone else. Now, that's not always going to be true, right? All states won't offer self-sovereign credentials for birth certificates on the first day, right? So your Social Security stuff might happen all at once, your W-4s, all of that. So there's sort of this like ebb and flow process that's going to happen, as we move through this, where it benefits the people that use it and that come from the places that provide credentials, right? And then doesn't benefit others. And hopefully that will encourage more states and governments to provide those credentials.
Just from an implementation perspective, how do you balance performance and security? A long chain would be slow,
I don't know,
and a shorter one would be easier to crack.
Yeah, so this is the question with blockchain, right? So it's not, and self-sovereign tries to minimize that by using the blockchain in a very specific small context where it's more reads than writes. But the rest of it functionally is very much like a website that's distributed. So I have high hopes that the bandwidth is there. The processing is larger, and depending on the keys that you use, obviously it can take longer. But it's not terribly different than a secure website loading from a bunch of different places. Does that make sense? That's what I think. We don't really know, right? We don't have a lot of big implementations at this point where we have, a billion people trying to access it. So there will definitely be performance challenges. And we hear about that from vendors right now, actually.
Good afternoon. Is it trust like digital or confidence like binary? Like
can you repeat
analog?
that?
Like, do you have a 100% trust that the transaction actually occurred, or is it a consensus on your distributed network that says, yeah, we're confident that this is an actual true transaction?
So you're talking about the writing process to the blockchain?
Yes.
Okay. It depends on the blockchain.
So it's not specific.
That's right. So some blockchains require a larger amount of consensus than others. Some of them are faster than others. But generally, self-sovereign supports multiple implementations of blockchain. And really, it's just a matter of writing the APIs for that chain. So, almost any chain could be part of it. But then you get sort of that user experience piece where you as a user can decide where you want your stuff you know.
So how do you quantify that? Because there could be a chain that it's weaker on purpose.
Sure, yeah. So that's a great, segue to say there is no blockchain certification authority, right?
What does that mean?
There's nobody saying that this blockchain is good and that blockchain is bad, right? So it requires some internal investigation as far as sort of a buyer beware kind of problem. But what we hope, right, is that the wallets are really the ones that decide what blockchains they're going to give the users access to, because that's the functional UI software. And so we're hoping that the people that do wallets will make good choices, and you can always read about it and find out. I mean, we know some blockchains are better than others, and frankly, you can do self-sovereign without a blockchain. It is definitely possible. You just don't have that sort of extra assurance that that back end has not changed.
Thank you.
Sure. Somebody in the self-sovereign world is going to send me a really bad email that I said that.
So I have a question more around the lines from each of the individuals. So like
Sure.
in your example up here,
Yep.
Sure, the wallets make the decision to take that risk on, but having like a CA, you have someone to blame if something goes wrong,
Mhm.
in a centralizer, kind of model. I don't know of any blockchains, typically right now they write that this exists. I think more value comes on Pat, or someone's doing business with Pat would want to know how many times did they attempt to be an alumni of this university and get denied? Because I believe it only writes once they're an alumni, not how many times they attempt.
Okay, well, you bring up a good point, and there are plenty of people that can benefit from knowing more things about Pat, but part of the core philosophy in this system is that Pat gets to decide what other people get to know, right? So if you meet somebody on the street and they ask you, how many times did you try to graduate? You don't have to tell them, right? It's not something that, it's your information to share or not share. And so if Pat wants that out there, that's fine. And whether someone else can benefit or not isn't germane to whether or not Pat has the rights over that data. Does that make sense? He wants to say more, whoever took the mic.
I argue that a bit, but
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm doing business with Pat,
Mhm.
it goes back to the social engineering aspect of it. I can brute force my way in there eventually. And now I'm saying, I do want to know the laws around that transaction.
Yeah, so.
I'm taking the 100% risk on my end doing business with Pat.
Well, no, you can ask for the information, and if he doesn't provide it, you don't give him, you don't do business with him, right? I mean, just ask for it. If he doesn't give it to you, then bye. Right?
Yeah,
and that's how identity is supposed to work, right? I mean, I know there are people who follow people on the internet and really creepy about it, but in ideal situation, we call them and have a conversation. Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Oh.
You want me to go? Okay. No, I was just going to make a comment on your point and to the point earlier. So hopefully the blockchain is deep enough that it's very hard to reconstruct it. So it's cryptographically very difficult to even reconstruct that. So that's number one, as a basic essence of it, to answer your point.
Yeah.
And then on the gentleman's comment there regarding, I mean, if somebody does not have much of a sort of a graph, if you will, to get started around assertions, I submit that your first assertion is coming from the hospital or wherever you were born, because they're going to issue and say, you know what, birth certificate.
Yeah.
Everybody has one. So anyway.
Well, not newborns.
I mean, yeah, but I'm saying that the hospital has authority to then issue to say that this person was born and this is a parent or whatever, right? Things like that sort. So what I'm trying to say is
over a huge legal hurdle, by the way. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, so but I'm saying that the assertions about you may come from third parties which are trusted to begin with.
Yeah.
So and then those And then it also becomes a matter of policy. And this is where I was going to say that's a segue into policy aspects as well. As this thing starts to take hold, it does need some policy framework that says, okay, we accept these forms of identity as muckpots where you start from.
Yeah. So let's quickly, we've been kind of dancing around the darker side of this, so I'll just dive in at this point. If your job is looking at loads of data for cybersecurity, your job is going to get very, very difficult in this domain. Because every one of these documents, I think I went the wrong way. Yeah, every one of these documents can be pairwise pseudonymous. So this isn't Bitcoin where I have an identifier per transaction, right? Or that follows transaction to transaction. Pairwise pseudonymity means that this is not correlatable with anything else. The only place you can do that correlation is in the wallet. So if you don't ask me, good luck, right? And if I don't give it to you, good luck. There are bad implementations where, well, I say bad. You may not say bad if you're looking at mounds of data, but there are implementations that you could use the same public key across all of these transactions and the same DID across all of these other things, but that would be less secure, wouldn't it? From my perspective as a user, my stuff would be less secure. If you can see it, so can someone else. Okay, go ahead.
Following what you just said, I think this framework has benefit in guaranteeing privacy or improving privacy.
Yeah.
But from the defense perspective, if I'm looking at attribution, this basically cut all the tools that I have to do that, because anybody can adopt a role or an identity for certain things and then change it for doing other things. And I cannot correlate these two to the same person.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That is correct.
Okay. And is it a good thing or a bad thing?
So it depends on your perspective, right? The average law-abiding citizen, it's pretty good. But remember, why are you doing that? You're doing it to protect something. That something that needs to be protected can now be protected differently, right? Because now, in order to gain entry, you can demand access to specific information that's verifiable in a way that has never been verifiable before. So if you are in law enforcement or intelligence and you're looking at vast amounts of data and looking for targets, that is a problem. You are going to have a problem. If you are protecting a network, you have a solution, right? And you have a solution like none you've ever seen before as far as the strength of the identity and the ability to continuously verify across that network as that person goes through, right? You have also, if you are a government or if you are a business, you have inherently built-in compliance with any possible privacy regulation that any sane person could think of already built into the system, because you are holding no private information. None. Right? And anything that you do have was cryptographically signed by the user when they handed it over to you and said, okay for you to use it. And you can go back to that document and there is no like, I didn't mean to give you that, because here it is with the digital signature on it. Right? And I haven't even got into constitutional stuff yet. Like, yeah, this goes deeper and deeper and deeper. I hope you're excited about it. I hope that, hope you guys follow up on it, right? Do some Googling. There's plenty of stuff out there. Self-sovereign identity, Mitre didn't invent it. We're late to the party, frankly, but you can see how important it is for the cybersecurity mission, for the national security mission, for the privacy mission, for the healthcare mission, for the FAA mission, right? There's no mission that digital identity doesn't have an impact on. And we're talking about a fundamentally different construct for how identity works on the internet that is completely scalable and offers a level of security heretofore unavailable to us. Also, enables criminal networks like nobody's business.
All right, we have
It's a give and take.
5 minutes left, so if anyone has a question that Chris can wrap up in 5 minutes, can you hand a mic back to her? Do you have one?
Very simple question. Are there any vendors, active vendors out there?
Yes. So absolutely. I would caution you, right? Because there's not any kind of accreditation or certification. This sort of, there are vendors out there, and most of them have at least part of this ecosystem solved. But the bottom line is, this is like, I don't know if anybody is AT&T customer, but like your phone all of a sudden one day said 5GE or some, yeah. It's like, what? You didn't do anything. You just changed, what was that? So you kind of have to watch out, because do dig deep into how that data is flowing, what they're doing with it. And first, make sure you understand what self-sovereign is and what it means, so that you can evaluate it, because it's not all technology. You can't just look at the blockchain. You can't just look at any one component. You have to look at them together, how they behave, and the policies that surround it. And frankly, the most demoralizing thing about all of this is the regulatory stuff. Frankly, if we don't have laws that support this, there could be a failure to launch problem. So. Was that 5 minutes?
No, it was only one.
I got 4 more questions.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Can you please use the microphone? That's okay.
Do you kind of see this as being supranational?
Yeah.
Basically?
Yeah.
And could you see that, however, that some credentialing or identifying could have greater weight than others? For example,
Absolutely.
a state identification, literally a, United States.
For some
state.
states, yes.
Yeah, that would kind of get around the problem of disadvantaging small adopters to large network people. If they had that core heavily weighted identification, everything else might be a little more frivolous.
So the people who came up with the concept and sort of founded the movement, I will call it, I hate using that word, are also very focused on the UN resolution to have everybody in the world have a digital identity, right? And this basically functionally enables that, because if a DID is just a URL, it doesn't necessarily require a smartphone, right? So there are other ways to have this data stored and utilized. And we haven't really come up with that yet, but it is possible that it could live in a smart card or, other things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. And there was 2 behind you.
That's 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Aside from regulatory laws,
I hope it's all true.
aside from regulatory laws, what other challenges do you see forestalling the widespread adoption of this platform?
So I mentioned the two-sided market, right? There has to be a place to use it in order to have users, and there have to be users in order to have a place to use it. My hope is to sort of influence that by starting to do work at the state level with Maryland specifically next year, but that work hopefully leading into a larger discussion with the state CIOs writ large to be able to potentially bring about a state level movement to have self-sovereign identity be available generally to citizens. And at that point, right, now we can start talking about regulatory stuff. Because once it's available from the state as a credential, the state can mandate its use, or actually mandate its use is a strong word, but they can start to make laws around its use. And if you look at what Wisconsin is doing, Wisconsin. Let me get back to you on that. I think it's Wyoming, actually. In the identity space and the blockchain space, it is very interesting. They're actually starting to make laws that support this already, and they don't even have a system. So good on them. And hopefully we can start to mirror that in other places. I don't think the federal government has any hope of making any rules anytime soon. Did I say, was I on mic?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We'll cut that out, right? Okay, yeah.
So thank you so much for your rest
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for an excellent and engaging presentation here. I was going to ask you, amongst the different major foundations like the Linux Foundation, Ethereum, etc., who are the ones who are working on in this space?
So, wow, there's a lot of things going on in this space. The Sovereign Foundation is working on the backplane identity system. Verus One is working on I'm sorry, Sovereign is kind of working in the, from soup to nuts, except for the identity hub. Verus One is also kind of mirroring that, but on public unpermissioned blockchains. And there's just a lot of work going. The identity hubs, primarily Microsoft and the Decentralized Identity Foundation. I think it's a Linux Foundation that does Hyperledger.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Linux Foundation is knee-deep in Indy, which is the current purpose-built blockchain for identity. I am not advocating the use of any one of these things. We are still in a nascent stage of identifying these and evaluating them. So we've started, we joined Sovereign. That's not a tacit, go use Sovereign. That's us beginning to investigate and understand the ecosystem and the different things at play. Mitre's own internal capability in this space is very, very limited. And I'm also trying to work internally to build our own knowledge and capabilities so that when the government does ask questions, we have the answers.
Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. If you have any more truly burning questions, you can email them to us at techtalks@mitre.org, and I'll forward them to Chris, and he can decide if he wants to answer you. So thanks again for coming out. Hope to see you again next month. So keep an eye on the website for the next Tech Talk. And thank you again, Chris, for talking with us tonight.
You're welcome. I love talking.